Hello there. My name is Alison Shaloe, and I am a midwife, a lactation consultant, and a spirit baby intuitive working in the UK. And I am also a spirit baby medium, and I support women on their journeys through conception, through pregnancy, and birth. And I started a podcast recently called Birthing the New Humanity podcast. And there's one of the episodes that I'd really like to share here, which is about the history of childbirth and why we are where we are now. So let's begin, really. Um, Basically, it's important to think about where we are now. And I'm hoping that in this episode of my podcast that I can lay the foundation of why we are where we are now in relation to birth and in relation to the work that I do now. And despite the fact that women have been birthing for millennia, there have been big cultural shifts that have changed the face of birth and how we see birth today. Birth is a huge part of who we are, and it is crucial to our evolution. Birth matters. The way we feel about birth matters. The way we're born matters. How we are treated at birth matters. And during birthing, it all matters. It matters to women, birthing people, their partners, and it matters to babies. And more importantly, it matters to society. Now, there have been many changes in the birthing arena, and now we are at the cusp of a further paradigm shift. What we know about birth is that what happens at birth can impact our lives. Birth often is a mirror of a society at large, and it's evidenced when you look at the history of birth and its impact on women. So, birth practices truly reflect the attitudes of the culture and have, over the centuries, been quite demeaning of women and completely disrespectful of both the mothers in labour and of the process of birth. So, we're going to just go back a little bit in history. So, there is archaeological evidence from Marija Gimbutas, an archaeologist, and Max Dashu, who was a historian, and they discovered evidence of matrilineal societies which were dating back to 40,000 years BC. And a matrilineal society is a society in which the group adhere to a kinship system in which ancestral descent is traced through the maternal line instead of the paternal line, as it is now. And property was also passed down the maternal line. So in the Neolithic period, which was about 10,000 to 3000 BC, we were in a matrifocal, matrilineal culture, one in which the mother is at the centre. Now, it was a time when women and the earth was seen as sacred, fertility was celebrated, men and women lived in harmony with each other and harmony with the earth. And early religions were founded on the worship of female deities, like the mother goddesses. And women were worshipped. The goddess was present, and she was perceived as part of the universe, who embodied all the forces of life, death, and also rebirth. Shrines were built in her honour, and the goddess was inherent in all of nature. Women's bodies were considered holy because they had this magical ability to give birth and to create new human beings. Now, during that period of time, people were more aware of their cyclical nature. They were in tune with the earth and the moon, they connected to their ancestors, and birth was seen as a sacred spiritual event, combining body, mind, and spirit connection. Birthing women were supported by other women. Giving birth, it was perceived as a major life transition to the woman, and it reinforced social bonds between families in the community. And traditionally, women came together to sit, to find meaning of each birth of the mother and baby, and the culture as a whole was like medicine. Women were cared for in childbirth by other females. Now, around 30,000 BC, there were representations of the vulva, a human female that was carved in stone and painted with red ochre. It turned up all over Europe. They appeared on cave walls, as people will have gathered ceremonially in caves, which were places of initiation rites. They were seen in small amulet-sized sculptures, which were associated with the mother goddess. Women used them to support them during birth. Now, the vulva is a symbol of birth, representing beginnings, fertility, and of course the gateway to life itself. You might have heard of a Shaloe, which was basically a carving of a naked woman displaying an over-exaggerated vulva. It was mostly found in Europe on castles, cathedrals, and other buildings, but very few of them remain today. And it was thought that they were to ward off evil spirits, but they've also been seen to represent fertility and women's empowerment. These carvings were an acknowledgement of the power of the woman and her ability to give life. Now, in statues found around the world, there were depictions of birthing women surrounded by other women. And often the women giving birth appeared larger than the other women in the images and sculptures. And these signs and symbols did exist in the goddess cultures around 3000 BC. The symbols started to decline with the start of the Bronze and Iron Ages. And during those times, birth was seen as a sacred spiritual act that involved women connecting to their bodies, birthing wisdom, connecting to their intuition, connecting with their ancestors, and connected to the earth and the cycles of the seasons, with an understanding that they were part of the earth and the cosmos, and they were connected to the divine mothers, the goddesses. Now, some of this has continued in other communities and tribes around the world up to today, but certainly not in the West. In my recent trip to Egypt, it was all there on the walls of the birthing temples. It was there in hieroglyphics, which is ancient stuff. Women supporting women in upright birthing positions, often kneeling or squatting on two bricks, which were placed underneath each of the buttocks of a woman in labour. The hieroglyphics also depicted the use of sacred oils, herbs, and musical instruments for birthing, which included sistrums, which is like a baby rattle, and the frame drum. And these were the tools and technology of the time. The frame drum was a tool used to assist women during fertility and birth rites. It was believed that women experienced a different level of consciousness when the frame drum was played. However, this has all stopped when the church banned its use because they recognised its connection with women's spiritual power. And then came the nomadic Indo-European tribes from Northern Europe and Central Asia. And they migrated into Western Europe with a belief system focused on a father god who ruled from the heavens above. And the tribe's enemies were groups who worshipped the goddess. And the patriarchal tribes conquered and destroyed these goddess cultures. Homes were burned, values and beliefs were suppressed, women were enslaved and exploited, and stripped of their positions of authority. Women were disempowered when expressing their sexuality, their intelligence, and self-sufficiency. And we have this in our DNA. This is in our line, and it's playing out in our world today. And archaeological findings show that there was a destruction of Neolithic cultures in Europe as those patriarchal tribes imposed their ideas on the people. Priestesses of the goddess were forced to marry the leaders to destroy the lineage through the mother line. Those who refused to marry, they were put into enforced celibacy and became nuns. And patriarchal religions took over. They changed the ancient system of matrilineal inheritance, and the church acquired a significant amount of properties. They built their places of worship on top of goddess shrines, and they changed the stories from the divine feminine to suit the masculine narrative, which we have now. And the goddess became distorted from an image of compassionate mother and the source of life to a symbol associated with darkness, evil, and death. Women became the properties of their husbands and fathers as the church attempted to change the way people thought. And then, of course, eventually people were disgusted by the church's greed for wealth, and they began to see through their untruths. There was much disharmony, and there were many victims at that time. So from the 1100s to the 1600s, there was a 500-year reign of organised terrorism by the church. The purpose was to rid the population of those who didn't go along with the religious doctrine. Anyone who was found to be opposing the system was excommunicated and then handed over for burning and execution in the witch trials. Many of the women labelled as witches in the past were actually respected members of their communities. They were wise women, traditional birth attendants who were the village healers, midwives, herbalists. They had extensive knowledge of the healing properties of herbs and ability to connect with their intuition and inner knowing. They were seen to have magical powers and were accused of witchcraft. The knowledge they held threatened the religious narrative, and the Roman Catholic Church accused midwives of not adhering to the curse of Eve, which was all about original sin, and that the childbearing experience is a painful punishment and all women should withstand it. Midwives were forbidden to assist women to prevent conception by relieving them of unwanted pregnancy or to ease the pain of labour. So anyone using herbs or plants to assist women in labour to help ease labour pain were reported to the church and sent on witch trials. 1484, the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, was written by Reverend Kramer and Reverend Sprenger, and this was the blueprint for every judge on how to conduct a witch hunt. This is also in our DNA. Often a witch hunt only crime was to be a woman, and approximately 85% were women, and then children died, and the numbers range from the death of 200,000 up to many as 9 million, depending on what you read. And sadly, when all the witches, wise women, midwives were gone, their wisdom and knowledge of herbs, fertility birthrights and rituals, and alternative healing to support women in birth died with them. And this is a legacy that is in our DNA, which has had a massive impact on us today and on birthing practices. And this is why we are currently in a place of remembrance to reclaim the knowledge and the feminine wisdom that was lost, a reclamation of the divine feminine ways. And given that what happens to our ancestors can affect us epigenetically, it's possible that we can be holding on to the remnants in our own DNA from those experiences of connecting to our intuition and inner wisdom, and could subconsciously create fear in us. Now, up until the 16th century, the midwives learned midwifery from the previous generation. The knowledge was passed down, there was no formal training, but they certainly knew how to support women during birth. Now, birth has always been risky, and throughout history there have been high rates of mortality that thankfully has reduced significantly in the West, but still remains an issue in many parts of the world. In the 1600s, obstetric forceps were invented, but weren't widely used during childbirth until the early 1700s. And that's because their inventors, a family of male midwives, kept them a secret for profit. Now, doctors decided that a woman's movement interfered with them being able to apply interventions in labour. So a barber surgeon, Jacques, he advocated the reclining position. As more obstetric tools were introduced over the decades, there was an even bigger reason for doctors to force women to recline during labour. And of course, it's easy to apply an intervention if the woman is lying down. The positioning of a woman laying on her back was to make it easier for doctors to see. Prior to this, women had always given birth in upright positions on birth stools and birthing chairs. King Louis XI had King Louis XIV had lots of wives and mistresses, and this possibly played a huge part in the changing of position. And according to legend, he had over 22 children. He had a fascination with observing women giving birth and disliked the squatting or sitting down position as it obstructed his view. It promoted the reclining position. It's reported that knowing the king was a fan of the lying down position, the lower classes began to adopt the practice. In 1651, Culpeper wrote an anatomical book which was based on the white male body, and he said in 1651, this was Culpeper, he had actually never attended a birth. He wrote this anatomical book based on white male anatomy and said that the female body was an imperfect variation of male anatomy. So the concept of an imperfect variation has penetrated the medical system up to now. It suggests that the female body is somehow defective, like a machine, and needs to be fixed or managed. There was the disappearance of midwives in the 17th and 18th century, and midwife status was reduced. And this created an inroad for male practitioners, barber surgeons they were known as, to perform forceps birth. And they claimed superiority over midwives on the basis that the use of obstetric forceps were classified as a surgical instrument. And at that time, women were legally barred from performing surgery. So this changed midwifery from traditional, often untrained midwives supporting women to doctors taking over birth and made lucrative businesses using forceps to get babies out. Up until the last century, most women gave birth at home with the help of other women and the local midwife. During the mid-1800s, medical forms of anesthesia were used. In 1853, chloroform gained popularity after Queen Victoria used the anaesthetic during her 8th child's birth. But there were side effects affecting the newborn, breathing, and maternal heart failure. And forceps were used during these births. In 1902, the Midwives Act was born, which called for registration of midwives, and the traditional birth attendant role was minimised. 1900s was the twilight sleep. Now, this was a treatment that involved scopolamine and morphine, and that allowed women to fall asleep and wake up without any memory of giving birth. But it did not suppress the memory of pain, and the drug's side effects were severe. Scopolamine caused women to lose their inhibitions and consciousness, while morphine did not prevent pain, but contributed to psychosis. Many women thrashed around, they screamed, and they were restrained in straitjackets or labour cribs to prevent injury. Babies were also significantly affected by the drugs, leading to the commonly used technique of holding them upside down and slapping them on the bottom to revive them. While the idea of pain-free childbirth was tempting, the dangers of twilight sleep were clear. The push for this drug may have been born out of a desire for convenience, but its consequences were devastating. There was then the introduction of enemas, applying warm water to the rectum. It was long held as an ancient traditional midwifery method to start labour, but doctors believed that the spread of childbed fever was being spread by bowel movements during labour. When a woman was admitted to hospital, an enema was given automatically. Another form of infection control was perineal shaving, fully shaved around the vulval, perineal, and anus area. And by the mid-1900s, so many women were having episiotomies that doctors wanted all perineums to be shaved. In the 1920s, hospital birth became more common, including the systemic use of forceps, episiotomy, and anaesthesia, as advocated by Dr. Joseph DeLee. These three practices showed in late 1980s to not be of any benefit. During the Second World War, birth became safer as men were in the armed forces, so the responsibility for childbirth was reclaimed by midwives, and birth became woman-centred for a short time before the men returned. And of course, there were very good outcomes. 1950s, Dr. Grantley Dick Reed proclaimed the benefits of natural childbirth without anaesthesia or tools in his best-selling book, Childbirth Without Fear. He worked with women in the East End of London, and he discovered that women who were less fearful of childbirth had pain-free births. And this book inspired Prunella Briance to set up a group which we now call the NCT, the National Childbirth Trust, as she wanted to find out more about his method. In the 1960s, the twilight sleep lost its popularity as news of its side effects spread, and 35% of birth took place at home. And in the 1960s, it was becoming more centralised places to give birth, and men actually started to attend the birth in the 1960s. Up until then, it had all been women. 1970s, the Peel report recommended that all women give birth in hospital in the 1970s. On the grounds that it was the safest place to give birth, women were often subjected to sedation against their wishes. They were confined to narrow or high beds and tables. They were placed in stirrups and were separated from their newborns after childbirth. And this move to hospital made it more pathologised. The woman's body was seen as a machine, that it didn't work well, so it needed to be managed. In the 1980s, women advocated for alternatives to giving birth in hospital, including home births and birth centres. Epidurals gained popularity, along with techniques like hypnosis, breathwork, and water birth. Fathers were usually allowed to stay with their partners through labour and birth, and the active birth movement was founded with Janet Velasquez, and that's all about being upright and having an active birth. So in the 1990s, there were many government policies to make birth more woman-centred. There was the Domino scheme, there were lots of continuity of care teams, and it was seen more as a natural process. And actually, that's when I trained, and it was really quite an exciting time. And I trained in a time where it was very woman-centred and very high vaginal birth rates. So in the 2000s, caesarean sections accounted for about a third of births. And by the early 2000s, over half of all women who gave birth vaginally received an epidural or spinal block. Now, today, women have more childbirth options than ever before. These include home birth, vaginal birth, caesarean section, gentle caesarean section. But there are more interventions used, many of which are not based on research evidence, but are there to support the institution. We have almost a 40% caesarean section rate and an ever rising induction rate. Now, during COVID, the home birth rate rose as women were afraid to go to hospital to give birth, but this has since decreased. There is now a massive shortage of midwives who've left the profession due to working conditions, and the service is at breaking point. There's also been an increase in free birth, where women are choosing not to engage in maternity care services at all. And whilst I'm not advocating that, it's important to acknowledge that women are beginning to take back control by not accessing maternity care. And this is in part due to the fact that they do not want to give birth in a medicalised system that doesn't meet their individual needs. Women are, for the most part, birthing in an environment of risk that's not based on the women's needs, but the needs of the institution. Women are beginning to demand more and to look at other options of birthing with an independent midwife, a doula, or a birth keeper, or indeed choosing to free birth. Most women want positive, natural, physiological births, and many plan for it, but in practice, it doesn't always happen that way that women want it to, and this is often due to birth interventions and the culture of risk and fear in maternity care services. Women want to come out of birth feeling empowered, where they are an active participant in the process, knowing their rights and knowing that it's saying no is an option if what they're being offered doesn't suit them. So given that, there is vast research knowledge of the importance of the environment and how it affects the cocktail of birthing hormones, and the importance of being upright to assist the body and the baby to descend, is still not being practiced in most hospitals, despite this knowledge is widespread. This leads to the necessity for more pain relief, often resulting in interventions that women do not want. This can lead to unsatisfactory birthing experiences and can lead to the increased rates of birth trauma that women feel after birth. Many of the interventions in birth lack research-based evidence. Instead, these practices serve as a means of regulation within powerful institutions, enforcing compliance and subservience among both staff and patients. So upon arriving at the hospital, women are met with a social system that curbs their behaviour, rewarding those who adhere to strict protocols while punishing those who deviate. The hierarchical structure in place prioritises conformity and obedience, ultimately contributing to an environment that can be detrimental to women's experiences during childbirth. It's like the inner good girl comes out when women turn up for birth, and what they need that powerful woman to step forward in birth. And the act of giving birth has been reduced to a medical procedure that is standardised to fit the hospital system. Unfortunately, this results in a lack of trust and attention given to each woman's individual body and birthing needs. Additionally, there is little respect for the personal journey of pregnancy and birth. and the sexual aspect of giving birth is often disregarded completely. It is an institutional priority to minimise the risk, and especially as there is a rise in litigation protocols based on numbers, timing, and measuring, with the assumption that birth is an abnormal event that needs to be managed. Whilst it is important, it does not take into account the individual needs of the birthing woman, so there needs to be a balance. However, modern birthing practices have evolved, and medical professions now oversee the majority of births in hospital settings, and the majority of doctors have not witnessed how natural birth and labour unfold. Standardised guidelines have been put in place to determine what is considered normal or abnormal during labour, and doctors are tasked with managing risk. So it is a fine balance. Everything is being managed from the outside. Midwives and doctors, for the most part, are relying on monitoring and protocols rather than their intuition. And women are relying on doctors and midwives and not on their intuition and inner wisdom. I feel it's important to note that there can also be a lot of fear in the birthing space from people in the room, including healthcare professionals, which can impact the outcome. I think it's important to highlight here that fear can be addressed and healed, and ideally before you give birth. And so there you have a very brief history of birthing and how a social construct can have a huge impact on birthing practices. And I believe now is the time that women begin to take back what is rightfully theirs. But it does mean taking responsibility for your decisions, your choices, and options. And you need support to do this. And I'd like to highlight that I'm not advocating vaginal birth for everyone, as there will always be a small number of women who will need medical intervention. And we're fortunate enough to have it when it's necessary. I want women to feel empowered enough to make informed decisions that are not based on fear, and they know intuitively what is right for them. Birth is an inner journey, and women have to move from the logical left brain of gathering information, knowledge, and begin to embody the experience, to trust their body's birthing wisdom, to recognise that birth is a sexual experience and needs the same environment as you would need during sexual intercourse. A quiet, safe, undisturbed environment is essential. It's important to remember that it is a rite of passage and a sacred act, that of bringing new life into the world. And it's my desire that women begin to feel more supported in their choices, because now there is more evidence about how babies can be affected by birth and that they have a consciousness of their own. So whilst I'm not suggesting to go back to the old ways, they are important to take into account, to find a new way that acknowledges the sacredness of birth, that is empowering for parents, is gentle for babies, and risk is minimized. I am setting up a sacred pregnancy circle shortly, so please follow me on my website, alisonshaloe.com, or on Instagram as alisonshaloe_. And I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit about the history of birth and its impact on women and birthing practices. And we've come to the end for today. But I'd like, please subscribe and like and even share, because there's some really important wisdom for women who are on their conception, pregnancy, and birthing journeys. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you for listening, and yeah, brilliant. Thank you.